Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Nemesis Games, which is Book 5 of the Expanse book series. So this video is part of a series of videos where I review the Expanse novels. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for the Expanse Book 5. And this is a very serious spoiler warning if you watch the show but you haven't read the books. You will not want to watch this video because it will spoil events to come in future seasons, so you have been heavily warned. Plus, I just think it would make a lot more sense to watch this video if you have actually read Book 5 of the Expanse series, Nemesis Games. So anyway, getting into Nemesis Games, I mentioned in my last review for Cibola Burn that perhaps Nemesis Games might be my least favorite book in the series and not Cibola Burn, but after I read Nemesis Games, I was like, what am I talking about? This book is great. But I think Cibola Burn is great as well, as I talked about in my last review, but I think I'm going to have to stick with that as my least favorite of the books so far. Keeping in mind that I love all the books and there's no bad books. I'm not saying it's a bad book, but I'm just saying out of all the Expanse books, which I think are all great, it's probably the least great of the great. This one might be my second least favorite. I'm not sure, but that's kind of just splitting hairs. I did really enjoy this novel, although it was really slow to get started. Now, here's the thing. When I watched a lot of reviews with the authors of the Expanse novels, Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham, otherwise known as their pen name James S.A. Corey. And I mainly saw a lot of interviews of them when the Expanse TV show was coming out, because they're also involved with the show. They were, I think, executive producers, if not outright producers. Apparently, they were not just the token producer or whatever. Apparently, they're actually hands-on involved. Not totally and completely. I don't think they really write the episodes themselves, but they're consultants. Apparently they're on, always on hand, and they have some say or some input anyway. Maybe not some total say, but they have input on how the show is written and what happens in the show. So they are involved in the show. It's not just like an author who just says, here's my book, you can go make the show. Like George R.R. Martin with Game of Thrones, he was somewhat involved in the show in the first 3 or 4 seasons, but now he's not involved at all. But I think from what I understand, it seems like Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham are more involved than George R.R. Martin ever was in Game of Thrones. I mean, they're not the showrunners, they're not the writers, they're still a writing staff, and there's still Nareen Shankar as the showrunner. But I do think they have more involvement, and I think from what I understand have a good working relationship with Nareen Shankar and the writers, and that they do often go to them for advice on how to adapt the novels. Now, the reason why I'm getting into this in this book in particular is because this book came out around the same time. It was being written around the same time that season 1 of the Expanse TV show was being written. Now, I've seen tons of interviews with the authors, Daniel Frank and it was Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham. Sorry, getting the names mixed up. Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham. I saw tons of interviews with them where they were asked if working on the show has influenced how they write the novels, and they always say no. They're always like, no, we're pretty firm on separating the two. We had our idea of what we wanted to do with the novels already in place before we even thought of this TV show idea, and working on the TV show hasn't really influenced, and we're really good at keeping those separate. After reading this novel, and then of course the following novel which ties into this novel, I'm gonna have to call bullshit on that. I'm sorry. This is just my opinion. I could be wrong, but I think even if the authors believe that the TV show has had no influence when they're writing the novels. I think maybe it's a subconscious influence that they're not consciously aware of happening, but I think it's happening. I mean, you may say, oh, maybe they had planned Nemesis Games all along, like from years ago. They already had planned to have James Holden, Alex, and Amos and Naomi all have different chapters and have this particular storyline. Maybe, but even if that's the case, I still think it's undeniable that the TV show has an influence on this novel. This novel, and again the subsequent novel, which is like part 2 to this novel, it feels like the show more than any of the other novels, even the first 2 that were adapted by the show. Like this, as I said, this material in this novel wasn't even covered by the show yet, but it still feels like this has the most. It has that same tone, that feel, the style that is present in the show. I think even more so than any other book, and so it's hard for me to read that book and see the style of the show come through so strongly in this book, and then take that with the knowledge that this book was being written around the same time that season 1 was being written, which, as I said, the authors of the novels were involved with, pretty much heavily involved with. It's hard not to come to the conclusion that working on the show has had influence on how they would write the novels. Now, you might wonder why I'm saying I think this book comes off a lot about the show. Well, first of all, like I found, particularly with book 3, Abaddon's Gate, and book 4, Cibola Burn, those books in particular felt very different than the show. When I read them, I was like, wow, this is nothing like the show. I can't imagine the show doing this. And of course, season 3, they did do Abaddon's Gate, and so they did a somewhat I think they took the show in a different direction there, where it did start to feel a little bit more like the novels, but it kept more of its identity. But even the first 2 books, like I could feel like there were parts of it that did line up with the show, but for the most part, I was like, yeah, this is different, a different style of writing than the show, because mainly it's like, I think the main difference is the viewpoint characters. Like the first book, it totally threw me that the only viewpoint characters were Miller or Holden. That made it totally different than season 1, which had so many different viewpoint characters. And the second book, well, it had more viewpoint characters, and those we're familiar with, like Bobby Draper and Prex and Avasarella, of course, who was introduced in season 1, but it still had it was more of a political mind thriller than the actual show was, where the show was keeping it more in the tone of season 1. But books 3 and 4 like completely went like totally different than the books, because they introduced all these new viewpoint characters that we hadn't really seen before. In book 4, we'd seen some of them, but they really were just minor characters, and so it was all about, oh, here's a totally new character, here's a totally new situation. And also each book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, they were all self-contained. They were like solo. This is the one story. It's kind of like a movie. I think they were even more self-contained, I would say, than like a Star Wars film, like Empire Strikes Back. I think it's even more self-contained than that. This is its own story, where the show, and the authors of the books talked about this in the show, they purposely tried to blend the string of stories together to not make and that's why they chose, which I actually think is a bad decision, to end the book material in the middle of the season instead of at the end, because they want to try to flow this all into one story. And you never got that in the books, because, as I said, each book was very much its own thing, and when another book starts, it's a couple years later, and it's a different situation, whereas in the show they tried to just blend events from all the books together. And so that's what this book does. This book is the first book of the Expanse series to not be standalone. It's actually kind of, you can see it as like part 1 of 2, really, where this is half the story. This is the setup, and the second half is concluded in Babylon's Ashes. And it seems like book 7 followed the same sort of format, where it is definitely not the end. I'm guessing that book 8 and 9 will be tied into book 7, but maybe book 7 will be completed in book 8 and book 9 will be standalone. I don't know, because they haven't come out yet. But it'd be my guess that book 7, 8, and 9 might form a trilogy, but maybe not. But we do know that books 5 and 6 form like a two-parter sort of thing, and which again, the first time the Expanse series did this. Before this, each book was completely standalone, and so it's being more like the show, where it's blending things together. Now, that's not the only thing. I think one of the main things is how the show always focused more on the four Rosinante crew a lot more, and you had other storylines, Sorella, Bobby Draper, Miller, and all that, and those were important characters as well. But the show has always done a much better, or focused more on fleshing out some of these supporting characters more, particularly Alex, Amos, and Naomi, who never to this point had viewpoint chapters. They're always just kind of supporting characters there in the background to support Holden, but you never got inside their heads, you never really got their backstory. Whereas this novel, you do get, instead of doing like what book 3 and 4 did, where they introduce a whole slew of new characters to be viewpoint characters who only appear in that one novel and never appear again, which is very unlike the show. They take the four main characters of the Rosinante, Alex, Amos, Naomi, and Holden, and make them the viewpoint characters. It's the first time they did this. And as I said, maybe the authors were always planning to do this. Maybe the show didn't have anything to do with their plans to do this. But it really does make it seem a lot more like the show, because the show likes to focus on these supporting characters of the Rosinante, and now the books are finally doing it as well. In fact, a lot of the backstories that are explained in this novel are at the very least teased in the show much earlier, as a way to sort of flesh out the stories. Like, for example, the show has already introduced the concept of Naomi having a son named Philip. In fact, this was teased in season 2, and she even outright confessed this to Holden in season 3, whereas in the novels it was never mentioned before this book. In fact, I really am of the strong mind that the writers hadn't thought up of her backstory, the fact that she had a son out there and totally wrote this novel, or shortly before. And then also Amos's backstory is teased a bit more in the show about Lydia and his backstory, and being a crime lord in Baltimore. That's teased a bit more in the season 2 and season 3, whereas in the in the books, it's like, again, not mentioned until this episode. And Alex's family is not mentioned pretty much at all, or hardly at all. He tells a little story about it in book 4, which is the first time you hear about it, but you don't really get into it until this book. Whereas again, the show has teased this since season 1. And again, I think it's not a coincidence that this book was being written at the same time as season 1 was being written. And then, of course, and I talked about this when I did my book to show comparisons about some episodes in season 2. There are some elements of this novel that are, I think, directly put into season 2, particularly the scenes on Tycho Station, because this novel introduces the character of Drummer, who in the show is introduced all the way back in season 2, which in story terms is way before this story takes place. So Drummer will go on to sort of replace other book characters, so she can be a constant. But it's kind of funny that she was introduced like way before, in the timeline she was introduced way before in the TV show than she was in the novels. Where here, it's obvious that they hadn't thought up of this character until this book. In fact, she's not really that prominent, doesn't have that much to do, and I would argue she becomes more prominent in later books because, again, of the influence of the TV show, because the actress did such a good job with the character that they started to like the character more, so the TV show incorporated her more, and I think that did influence the authors to incorporate her more into later books, which were written, like book 7, which was written around the same time as season 3 was being written, when Drummer was quite important, but I'll cover that more when I get to book 7. But But yeah, there's certain scenes like when Holden and Fred Johnson are in Tycho Station, and there's this, splinter group of the OPAs tries to take over Tycho, and then Johnson and Holden had to team up to stop them. They had to fight off these rogue OPA agents. That pretty much happened in season 2, but it was totally different context, of course. But it's. And here's the whole thing about the OPA being having terrorists, a terrorist side, and being more of a terrorist organization. That wasn't really explored. I never really got that impression from them, from the novels, from the first 4 novels. I mean, you got the impression there was that side of the OPA, but didn't seem that prominent or that big of a deal. But in the show, it pretty much introduced the OPA as a terrorist organization. That was their main thing, and so the OPA of the show never felt the same, never felt like the OPA of the books. It felt a bit different until this novel again, where this novel, the OPA in this novel felt just like the OPA in the show. So it's hard for me to say that the show didn't have a strong influence, especially when reading this novel. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just a big coincidence. But I totally do not believe the authors when they say that the writing the show had no influence on how they wrote the books. This and the next novel just feels really much like the show. But if I was going to touch on what I touched on before with the previous books, is how each book has a different sort of genre to it that's a mix of science fiction. Like the authors themselves said that book 1 was the detective noir genre, book 2 was the political thriller, book 3 apparently is a haunted house, but I still don't really see it. I mean, I guess it's kind of there. And book 4 is definitely a Western. Very strong Western connotations there. Trying to think of what book 5, the connotations, because it's hard for me to see any connotations other than the TV show. But if we leave that aside, I think it would probably be best described as a mystery novel. Now, this is a bit different. It's kind of similar to the detective noir genre of the first book, but this is different because it doesn't have that noir slant to it. It's more like a traditional intrigue type mystery. Not necessarily a whodunit, but sort of an intrigue. Different than political thriller, again. Different than book 2, which is this flat out political thriller. It's more of an intrigue. Political intrigue, if you know what I'm saying, or just flat out mystery. Because all 4 storylines you got people investigating a mystery where they don't know what's going on, or mainly the Alex and Holden storylines. Because Holden in particular is the one that storyline felt most like a mystery because the ship's disappearing. He's suspecting that there's an OPA uprising. Fred Johnson doesn't believe him, and Monica Stewart goes missing. It's just pieces, and the mystery just keeps building. In fact, I kind of like it. It's kind of good how each of the chapters intercut with each other, how the mysteries of the different storylines keep building sort of together and crescendoing, even though they're different mysteries. With Alex, you have the mystery, of course. Again, it's also connected to the missing ship, so it also has more to do with the Martian side of thing and how was there a Martian conspiracy going on where Holden's storyline dealt more with the OPA side of it, and Naomi, you have the mystery of the Marco Anaris and what is he up to. He's definitely up to something. Why'd they kidnap her? What's their end game? What's their plan? What are they going to do? And with Amos, I guess this side had less of a mystery element to it. Honestly, this is probably my least favorite storyline. I don't really see a mystery side to this, but the other thrust of the story, I think that it was definitely a mystery. But speaking of the different viewpoint characters, now let me get into each storyline. Let's start with Amos, because as I said, I think this is probably my least favorite. I still haven't read the Churn. Maybe if I've read the Churn, I might appreciate this a bit more. But honestly, I'm hesitant to read the Churn because I didn't find this storyline interesting, so it makes me wonder if I'd find the Churn interesting. I think this is definitely building a lot off of characters established in the Churn, which is a short story about Amos's backstory. And to be honest, and this is why I said I felt the first half of the novel I think was kind of the hardest to get through any of the first half of any of the novels, because I did find it a bit dull, particularly like the Amos and Alex stuff. And with Amos, it's like it did seem kind of unnecessary. And we get this whole backstory of him going to Lydia, the woman who raised him, and apparently she remarried to a nice old man, so he wants to help him out, so he goes to the gangster and sort of strong arms him. And I mean, it's a kind of cool scene in itself where he's in, talking to the gangster and trying to get him to help out the old dude, and Amos is being Amos, of course, and not refusing to back down, being all cocky. But whereas the gangster guy apparently had these weapons that could kill him instantly. I mean, that's kind of cool within itself, but this whole storyline seemed kind of I was never really that interested in it. It seemed, especially when compared to the other storylines. I kept wanting to get back to the Naomi stuff. I wanted to get back to the Holden stuff. I wanted to find out what was going on. I mean, I guess there's always one character viewpoint in every book like this. Like in book 2 was Prax, book 3 was Anna, and book 4 was Elvie. But it seems like Amos was the one in this book that was just kind of nah. Can I skip this chapter and get to the better ones? I mean, it got kind of interesting, even when the big disaster happened, which I'll get to shortly, and the Earth was destroyed or whatever, and he was trying to escape with Clarissa the Mountain. I like how he calls her Peaches. That was pretty cool. I did like the relationship that they built in this novel. I thought I really bought that and thought it was good. But even then, I wasn't as interested in the storyline as the other storylines. It still felt kind of like a detracting. Let's get on with this thing. Even though it was kind of interesting, I did like, as I said, the character development that they developed. But then in the end, when they ended up going back to the gangsters to try to help them to leave, I guess that justified having the gangsters there in the first place and justified Amos's first part of the storyline, but I still didn't really find it all that interesting. I'm sorry. I know a lot of people might disagree with me because a lot of people love Amos. I think Amos is a really cool character, but this storyline I just was not on board with. So let me get into Alex's storyline next, which again, the first part of it I think is totally useless when he goes to his ex-wife and she just tells him to fuck off, basically. And I was like, well, that was a waste of time. I mean, I guess you could say, well, the whole point is to show that he was being, he shouldn't have stirred up old rocks. But then it was the end of it. It didn't really have any impact. It seemed like the only narrative purpose that it served was to get Alex on Mars, get your ass to Mars, and that's the only reason that existed. And so we need an excuse to have Alex on Mars. Well, let's say he tries to spark up a relationship with his ex. Now, it should be known in the show he's married in the timeline of season 1 and 2, where you get the impression in the novels that they were divorced well long before that, and they actually don't have kids. Which is another huge difference because in the book they did have a son. So that's a sort of a different dynamic, which to me the show justifies more the involvement of Alex's family. This, I didn't think it was justified. I'm sorry. It was just there to get Alex on Mars. But once he hooks up with Bobby Draper and they start investigating the Martian ships, then it picks up, and then it starts to get a bit interesting, especially when Holden contacts them and they go out to investigate, and they have the Prime Minister of Mars are stuck on the ship, on the Razorback, and they're trying to save his life. I mean, it wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but it was interesting enough. Then we'll get into Naomi's storyline, which I think I liked. I think I did like the Naomi storyline. This is another storyline I do think got better over time. I think this is probably the best character building that they've done supporting characters. Like what they did with Naomi really flushed out her character a hell of a lot more. Like not to put her down too much because she did have her character traits and her character quirks in the first 4 novels, but she did seem kind of flat or not as dynamic as the way she's described in this book really makes her like completely a hell of a lot more like 3-dimensional and fleshed out and real than she had appeared in any of the novels. And as I said, the TV show had the advantage of hindsight where they could take this great character building that wasn't done until book 5, but since the show was starting later, they can influence that into all the earlier seasons, which is why Naomi comes off as a more full and believable character from the very beginning of the TV show. Whereas in the books, I think she felt a bit flat at first. I don't think they had that much thought of her backstory or her character dynamic until they got to this novel, and some of it I think is a tad inconsistent. Like I think she would be a bit behave a bit differently if they knew her backstory was this all along, which is why she does behave a bit differently in the show. But this is a very, it wasn't always the most exciting because a lot of it had to do with she was being held prisoner, which sometimes can be a bit dull to read. But it was interesting getting her different dynamics with people who used to be her friends that are keeping her prisoner. Of course, her very toxic relationship with the father of her child, who's a very... I think he's a very good villain. I think this is probably the best villain that they've had in the book series to date. I think Ashford would be my favorite before him, but I think Marco Inar's he's the best villain that they had so far. He was because he comes off as really, because some of the other villains, especially Mercury, were kind of just 2-dimensional. I'm evil. I'm doing this because blah blah blah. But he comes off as a very realistic portrayal of a megalomaniac who's very controlling and who spins everything. He's like has this charm, and he spends everything in his own mind to make it fit his own narrative and why he's in the right and why he's the victim, why he's the good guy, while he's off like committing genocide. Flat out committing like one of the worst genocides in the history of the human race, according to the novel, and he still thinks that he's the hero, that he's the victim, that he's in the right, and I think they did an amazing job at describing that kind of character, and also the relationship he has with Naomi, where he's very controlling, and again, he twists everything to be her fault. And it's interesting the different picture of who, not just Marco, but all the other people who used to know Naomi and her own son, the different idea they have of who Naomi is, which has readers of the novels we know from her experience and the things that she's done with James Holden on the Rocinante, that she is in fact a totally different person than who they think she is. She's actually a lot stronger, a lot more has her own convictions, but because her convictions don't line up with their own twisted convictions, they put her off as being misguided or naive, and they still think of her as weak, which she eventually does use to her advantage. In fact, she plays into that image that they have of her in order to escape and get what she wants and to manipulate people, which again is amazing character development. Very interesting story. Like the moment towards the end of the novel where she basically kills her childhood friend, her old friend, who's just trying to help her because he thinks she's trying to commit suicide, but really she's trying to escape. So he goes in to try to save her life, and they say in the novel several times that he very easily could have just beat her up. He could have stopped her, but instead he reached out to her as a friend, and then you could feel like Naomi had to kill him in order to get away. You could feel how much that decision hurt her, how painful it was for her to do that, because she knew that he was just there as a friend, that he genuinely was trying to help her, but she was being deceptive and lying to him. but it was all for the greater good to get away from Marco. And it's unfortunate that he couldn't see that, because he had a totally different perspective of Marco and of her that was really twisted. So it was really, that was such a powerful scene, and the whole storyline it could get frustrating at times because of how wrong and demented like Marco and his OPA band were, the Free Navy as they call themselves, just how fucked up and twisted they were, and how sad it was what they were twisting Philip, and how he'd become all fucked up because of this influence, and how he had a totally again, wrong image of who his mother actually was. I thought this was a very powerful storyline. But my favorite storyline of the novel is probably the Holden storyline. I did really enjoy this. This, to me, was a lot more engaging, a lot more interesting, even if it didn't have as strong of the character dynamics that were there in the Amos storyline. It was still, I think it was the through storyline of the book that kept the plot going. That it was really the intrigue, the mystery. It's the chapters I always wanted to get back to. I was like, screw this Amos thing. Let me get back to the Holden chapter. I wanted to see what's going on with the Holden, because it was a very interesting, and it's a change from Holden, from previous novels, because usually he has characters of Amos, Alex, and Naomi to play off of, but they're like putting him out of his element and putting him with a totally new, different cast of characters he has to deal with. That they bring in some familiar faces like Fred Johnson and Monica Stewart, and some new faces like Drummer, who of course, as I said, the show latched on to, and he has to deal with these characters and sort of to unravel this mystery. And of course it also deals with how heartbroken he is because Naomi is away, and how vulnerable he is without his normal support group, and he has to rely on these new people. But the relationship that Holden and Fred Johnson have in the storyline, I think, is a hell of a lot more interesting than anything they did in previous novels. I still do wonder if the show is going to skip over this, because as I said, they already took elements of the storyline and put it into season 2. So it makes me wonder if they're just going to, well, we already did that storyline, we did it here, so we're going to skip this whole thing. I hope not, because I really like the dynamic here of Holden and Johnson trying to unravel this mystery. Now, Holden's basically right that Fred Johnson being betrayed by the OPA, that he is a traitor in this mist, and that there's factions that are trying to kill him and oust him, basically. And at first he doesn't want to believe it, but then he has to come to the realization that that's the case. And then there's the whole thing about the trap they set with Naomi, where Holden pretty much falls right into the trap, but thankfully Naomi manages to get herself out of it. That was all really amazing stuff. I really enjoyed that. But yeah, I mean, I was just thinking more about how this is more, I forgot to mention how it was like, again, the TV show influence could be seen, where you have a lot of recurring characters like Fred Johnson, Monica Stewart, Bobby Draper especially, and Ava Sorella, who were barely in the novels before. They were in like prologue, the epilogue of book 4, but that's hardly anything. Which is what the show does. The show keeps the same cast of characters around. It keeps Fred Johnson around. It keeps Ava Sorella around. It keeps Bobby Draper around. Whereas the books before this book would just cycle through different, totally new characters. All right, we're done with Prax and Bobby Draper. Now let's move on to these characters. Now let's move on to those characters. But this novel, especially the next novel, will do this even more by bringing back characters like Anna and Prax, where it's just like, no, we're not. Let's stop cycling through characters. Let's have the characters that we already established and have them in. And I actually like that. That's something about this novel that I really like. The fact that it does that, because I was getting a bit irritated, particularly book 4, how they were just throwing away all the established characters and here's new characters, and I was getting sick of that. So it was actually good no, here's Bobby Draper again, here's Ava Sorella again, here's Fred Johnson again, here's Monica Stewart again, here's Clarissa Mal again. I did really enjoy that, and I did think it really worked for the novel. Now, let me get into this natural disaster, or not natural, this attack, basically, the genocide, where the Free Navy, as they call it, dropped the asteroids or the rocks, or whatever you want to say it, on Earth to basically wipe out, to decimate Earth. To, as I said, they call it the largest tragedy in human history, because trillions or billions of people die. It's now, when I first read this novel, I totally did not buy this. I was planning on coming on here to make a rant about how it's unrealistic, how Earth would have defenses in place to stop disasters, but I think I was getting confused with the TV show. Because the TV show did make it seem like all one needs to do is just point a rock and throw it at Earth in order to kill billions of people, which to me that doesn't make sense, because if technology has advanced so much where you can cause a disaster like that, that the defense technology would also in turn advance to prevent it from being so easy to try to cause a disaster like that. So I was going to go on a rant, but after reading the book again, I realized that they did address this. So I stand corrected. They did come up with a reason, which I guess I didn't catch the first time, with why the prologue where Philip went to Callisto to steal something. It was the Martian stealth technology, and he actually used that for the asteroids, for the rocks. So they were in stealth mode, and that's why they were able to slip through Earth's defenses. And usually, so it's not easy. It's not something that any rock hopper, any asshole with a ship could do. They couldn't just take a rock and push it towards Earth, which is what I thought, because I think the show kind of said at one point, oh, anyone with the thing can just push an asteroid to Earth and kill billions of people, which I think is bullshit. But that's not what they're saying, because in order to pull this off, they needed advanced, very highly classified, very hard to get Martian military technology, which the only reason they could get so easily is because of the whole Martian infrastructure falling apart because of the ring gates opening and of the vast majority of the population going through the gates and abandoning them, which feeds into that. So that actually makes perfect sense. So I'm not going to rant about it, because it actually does make sense. The book did go through and explain how this is able to happen, that it couldn't just be any asshole push the rock towards Earth, that it was because of this particular circumstances that they were able to acquire this advanced and rare technology in order to pull this off. So, okay, give him a pass on that one. Now, I want to get into Duarte a bit, and for this section, I'm going to throw up a spoiler warning for Book 7, because I might touch a bit on Book 7. So if you haven't read up to Book 7, you might want to stop the video here or skip this part, because I'm going to get a little bit into some Book 7 material, because Duarte, of course, becomes like Emperor Duarte, like a main villain figure, if not like the main active villain, but he's like the Emperor type main figure of Book 7, which of course I think will continue on to Book 8 and 9. And here's the thing, when I first read this book, I totally did not get this. I totally didn't understand what was going on until I read Book 7. And so reading this book again, it makes more sense to me. I was like, oh, now I get it. But see, because I didn't get that Duarte, because you get a scene where Alex meets Duarte, and Duarte is just like he seems like a typical bureaucrat who's under the guise of like helping Alex. Like, we don't even know that he was actually the mastermind that Alex is investigating, but he's not aware of this, which I think is actually really clever. But this book itself didn't really make that very clear. I don't think that came across, I didn't get it until I actually read Book 7. I suppose you get maybe the Vital Abyss explain this a bit more, where they corrupted Kotazar, but just from this book alone, even by the end of it, because when we got to Book 7 and they had the whole thing about Laconia, I was confused, because I thought that the epilogue of this book where you had one of the Martian ships go through and it falls victim to the phenomena that's going on that's eating ships or whatever, and everyone dies. I thought that was the main bulk of the rogue Martian fleet, so I thought they were done. Until I got to book 7, they were talking about Laconia. I was like, what do you mean Laconia? I thought they all died when they went through the thingy. But apparently it was just one rogue ship that the rest of them went through, and Duarte was like the emperor, the mastermind behind that, which I totally did not get from reading this book. I know I think they did mention in the epilogue that Duarte was the mastermind, but I couldn't remember that name from a chapter halfway through the book where Alex is just talking to some random dude. I'm not that good with names. So maybe, I guess, I get back to my complaint about something else. I don't think they explain well enough exactly what's going on, because I think they could have done a better job setting up Duarte and the whole book 7 storyline, because I didn't totally, when I was reading book 7, I was completely lost. It's not until I went back and read this book again in retrospect, actually, knowing when I know book 7, that this made a bit more sense to me. I was like, okay, I still think they could have done a better job introducing this character and setting him up, but that's just me. Anyway, my rating for Nemesis Game out of 10 is an 8. Extremely good. Really fun, really great novel. Enjoyed reading it. As I said, it has some really great character elements, particularly with Naomi and getting her backstory. They really fleshed out her character. Holden's storyline was really interesting, very exciting, very suspenseful. But I do think the book did have a really hard start. It was really boring, I hate to say, for the first part of it. It took a while to kick things in and to get going. And even when it did kick in, the Amos storyline did feel kind of... it wasn't totally unnecessary, because you had the Clarissa Mal and the relationship that he had with them, and they're escaping and seeing what the actual disaster on Earth was like. So that part was necessary, but it just wasn't as interesting as the other storylines, in my opinion. Particularly not until they got into the whole thing of Clarissa and Amos trying to escape the disaster. Up until then, I didn't think Amos' storyline was interesting at all. But still very interesting book, still very exciting book. It's the first book to end on a cliffhanger and not have a definitive ending as the other books, which is a bold move. I don't hate it. I don't think I don't give it extra points for ending on a cliffhanger, but I don't think it hurts it either. I think it's a good book. Anyway, that is it for my review of Nemesis Games. I will be back in about 3 weeks for my review of Babylon Ashes. This is part 2 of this 2-part that's in the middle of the Expanse series. So be sure to check that out. And of course, I'm going to continue to review the rest of the Expanse books until we get up to the release of book 8 in March. Can't wait for that. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and be sure to check out my channel as I do many more videos on the Expanse, as well as videos on many other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, Lost, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.